Hey, good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Wednesday, March 30th, 2023 at 9:07 in the morning. We're here to continue our look at H121. We have some new language suggestions from the Attorney General's office. Sarah is with us this morning, who will walk us through those changes. We also have our legislative counsel, David Hall, who is on Zoom in his office listening in as well. And Representative Williams is also on Zoom this morning. So Sarah, good morning. If you'd like to join us and walk us through this new language. And I think this was language developed from conversations that you had with various stakeholders, suggestions that they had, which you incorporated. So, good morning.
Good morning. Sarah Chavez, Attorney General's Office. Thank you for having me. I tested negative for COVID this morning after catching it over the weekend, so I'm glad I can be here in person with you all. Before I walk through the bill, there are a few things I just want to refresh on that I think would be helpful. So in the privacy space, as you probably all know, there's no federal privacy standard currently. And so it falls to the states to fill in those gaps. We have seen several states over the past 2 or so years pass various forms of comprehensive privacy legislation. California, Colorado, Utah, Virginia, Connecticut, and I believe last week, Iowa passed their own comprehensive privacy law. In addition, over 17 states have introduced some form of privacy legislation this legislative session. And that includes 2 states, New Jersey and Oregon, that have taken cues from Vermont and are now looking to implement their own data broker registries. We're kind of on the cutting edge there. I also want to just briefly mention the GDPR, which is the European Union's privacy law, much more comprehensive, overarching, and strict than anything that's happening in the United States, including California's bill, or law rather, which is arguably the most comprehensive and largest privacy bill out there currently. And I say all of this not just as a reminder for where we are in the privacy space in the US, but also just to highlight that this bill, H121, is much more incremental in nature, much less comprehensive than what a lot of other states are doing. And so while there have been certain concerns highlighted about this bill, I think our office is much less concerned because this is much more piecemeal in nature as opposed to overarching. So I just wanted to highlight that. So I will share my screen. You all should have some form of this markup. I did make a few small changes since sending the version to the committee yesterday, and I will highlight where those are.
Okay, and this is on our webpage, today's agenda. Well.
Okay. Okay, great. So before I start, I'll just mention I do not draft laws for a living. So relying on legislative counsel to sort of streamline the changes we've made here. And as the chair mentioned, on the whole, these changes reflect concerns that were raised by the committee, legislative counsel. It also incorporates changes based on feedback we received from stakeholders, and also tries to bring this to current times, so to speak. Vermont was in kind of a strange place where we engaged in stakeholder engagement for a privacy law before other states were doing that. Then COVID hit and kind of put the brakes on that process. Now, other states have surpassed us in the privacy space. And so this tries to reconcile what other states have done kind of on a uniform basis with what Vermont is doing more kind of incrementally, if that makes sense.
Okay, as we go through it, could you let us know, where there are language changes, how closely that tracks to other jurisdictions?
Yes, and I actually have, you're going to see kind of my dirty version with the comments inserted just because it's easier for me to follow. And that includes reference to where, we've solicited help from other states. So specifically, I'm only going to go through what our office changed. I'm not going to go through the whole bill. Lots of new definitions. It clarifies and sort of beefs up the data minimization section because there was some confusion around there. And it inserts a laundry list of exemptions, which is consistent with what we've seen from other states. And it makes clear that we're not trying to put additional burdens on businesses that are already beholden to certain privacy standards, depending on the type of information they collect or sell. And finally, I'll just say, you'll see this as I go through the bill. This draws pretty heavily on what California and Connecticut have done. Okay, so we will go through this and start with the definition of biometric identifier. So I changed this a bit, I'll just read it. It means the unique biometric data generated from measurements or technical analysis of an individual's biological characteristics, such as a fingerprint, a voice print, eye retinas, irises, or other unique biological patterns or characteristics used to identify, and I think I'm missing a word there, an individual. So I altered this a bit to basically update it. So what we had before was based on Illinois' BIPA law from 2008. This is now drawn, this is a hybrid of what Connecticut and Oregon have done. And it addresses concerns that were raised by the committee around reproductive cycles and as well as voice recognition. So this makes it more clear that those things are captured under this definition for purposes of the BIPA. Any questions there? Okay, scrolling down. Okay, de-identified data. So this term, we see it throughout other definitions in this bill. This is also very common in other state privacy laws. We just want to make clear, what de-identified data means, meaning your social security number, your date of birth has been encrypted, you can no longer identify it. And so I'll just read this. De-identified data means data that cannot reasonably be used to infer information about or otherwise be linked to an identified or identifiable individual or a device linked to such individual if the data collector or data broker that possesses such data, A, takes reasonable measures to ensure that such data cannot be associated with an individual, B, publicly commits to process such data only in a de-identified fashion and not attempt to re-identify such data, and C, contractually obligates any recipients of such data to satisfy the criteria set forth, in paragraphs A and B of the subdivision. I think that can probably have a little wordsmithing from legislative counsel put in there, but overall, I think this is an important definition that we include. Moving on, then of course, because we reference identifiable individuals in the de-identified data definition, we then define them here. Means an individual who can be readily identified directly or indirectly, reference to which includes but is not limited to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, precise geolocation data, or an online identifier. And again, this is just for consistency. Okay. Okay, personal information. As a reminder, this was inserted into the bill. This is new. And this is sort of the umbrella term for that includes personally identifiable information and brokered personal information, as well as login credentials and covered information. It was mentioned that covered information is not actually defined in this bill, and it hasn't been defined in the statutes, even though covered information is referenced in the statutes, and that has to do with HIPAA. So I just added the line as defined by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. I think I will say what I have seen other states doing is they have just an umbrella term for what they define as personal information or personal data. And you can see here in my comment, the typical definition that we've seen in Connecticut, Virginia, Colorado, for example, also California, is any information that is linked or reasonably linkable to an identified or identifiable individual. Personal data does not include de-identified data or public information. It would be a big change if you were to get rid of PII, brokered PI, and just have one definition. I don't think it would be a big change for this bill. It could be a big change to reconcile it in all the other statutes PII is referenced in. I don't know all those statutes. However, if you want to just have a clean kind of definition that captures every kind of personal information out there, it's a possibility. So I just wanted to float that. This is the way the bill is currently drafted. I think it was done to avoid having to make all those other changes in the statutes. So I just say that for context and for you to think about.
Sorry, a specific question. Just back to the HIPAA reference, and I think I know the answer to this, but just to clarify. So that is just referencing how HIPAA defines personal information. It is not somehow linking to, this only applies for the entities that are regulated by HIPAA or need to follow HIPAA.
Yeah, it's actually covered information as defined by HIPAA.
So
Yeah,
the concept of the definition, it's not all the other pieces that go along with
that's right.
HIPAA. Okay, just want to clarify.
Okay. Precise geolocation information. This is commonplace in several privacy laws we've seen passed. And it has become very important in the reproductive rights space since there have been news stories about data brokers, right, who can actually pinpoint your location if you're near an abortion clinic. And so I think this was an unintentional omission from the original bill that we wanted to ensure is included. So precise geolocation information means information derived from technology, including but not limited to global positioning system level latitude and longitude coordinates or other mechanisms that directly identifies the specific location of an individual with precision and accuracy within a radius of 1,750 feet. So very wonky definition, I guess. It is, this is lifted from Connecticut. And I believe I've seen it in other laws as well, including California. And again, this will come into play as we sort of go through the bill. Now might be a good time to also float the idea, I did not include it in here, but what we've seen other states doing as well is including a definition of sensitive personal information. And so that includes precise geolocation information. And I have to refer to my notes here. It also includes racial or ethnic origin, religious belief, sexual orientation, whether you're the victim of domestic violence. And what these laws have done is prohibit the use or sale of sensitive personal information. I don't believe we currently have anything like that in Vermont. Could be something you want to consider here.
So I just want to, again, clarify. So what you're saying is, I think, we have two options. We stick with the personal information and the personally identified information that's in current Vermont statutes. Or we switch it to the more up-to-date, which is personal information and personally sensitive. Is that what you said?
Sensitive personal information.
Personal information.
That's right.
Which is the more up-to-date common.
Yes.
Okay.
So moving on. Predictive analytics. This term is used in the data minimization portion of the bill as I updated it. And this is lifted from Consumer Reports. And this is important when it comes to how data collectors are selling or data brokers are processing and selling personal information. So this means any form of automated processing or personal information to evaluate, analyze, or predict personal aspects concerning an identified or identifiable individual's economic situation, health, personal preferences, interests, reliability, behavior, location, or movements. Okay.
Sarah, so I see that was pulled from Consumer Reports.
Mm-hmm.
Does any other jurisdiction use this definition in their?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that offhand. What I've seen a lot of jurisdictions doing, is instead having more encompassing clauses where they do not distinguish the type of use a data collector or a data broker is engaged in. They simply say, you can or can't do X, Y, Z. What we have done in this bill is say, if you're engaged in targeted advertising, if you're engaging in predictive analytics, then you are beholden to certain conditions. So I would say we're being a little more targeted. Does that make sense? Okay, so what process or processing means was brought up as a concern a few weeks ago because we don't have it defined, and this is important in particular for data brokers. Excuse me. Who will actually take personal data, package it up, process it, and then sell it. Excuse me. So this is lifted from Connecticut, and it means any operation or set of operations performed, whether by manual or automated means, on personal information or on sets of personal information, such as the collection, use, excuse me, storage, disclosure, analysis, deletion, or modification of personal information. I'm gonna get a cough drop, excuse me.
Since I have
I
some.
just looked up that last one, and it seems like Colorado passed a predictive, the predictive analysis
Yeah.
piece and then a bill in 2021.
Similar language?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's unfair discrimination. And your insurance.
Thank you, God. Okay, you already got it.
All right.
Sarah, let us know if this, you're just fresh from COVID. If you need to take a break, you can take 5 and, so you can, rest your vocal cords. So just let us know when you get to that point.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think this will help. Okay. So moving on, publicly available information. Upon reflection, I think the bill, as it was drafted before, recommended that the AGO have a conduct a study on what is public. And this is important. I said earlier that states have surpassed Vermont in this space now. And they have a definition of publicly available information already on the books. This is lifted from Connecticut, but it is consistent with what we've seen in Colorado, Virginia, California, excuse me. And so I would recommend that in lieu of a study, that we simply follow what other states have already been doing. That seems to be the easier thing to do. And selfishly, I would love to not have to conduct a study. So, excuse me. Publicly available information means information that A, is lawfully made available through federal, state, or municipal government records or widely distributed media, and B, a data collector or a data broker has a reasonable basis to believe a consumer has lawfully made available to the general public. Now, I've included this section B because it's consistent with what other states have done. But I'm a little concerned it could create a loophole for data collectors and data brokers. You could argue that anything that you thought, oh, yeah, I have a reasonable basis to believe that this was public, whether it's a Facebook post or something like that. It's a little concerning. On the flip side, I worry that we might run into First Amendment issues if we don't include something like this. So it may be one of those uncomfortable things that we kind of sit with for a little while and think about what is best in the public interest. Does that make sense? Okay.
Emma?
So on this piece, Sarah, have other states who've had this in place already, like Connecticut, have they had experience with, I don't know, they just had, they've been implementing it. So has there been evidence where this has started to create some concern from consumers, where data brokers or collectors are scraping information off of people's social media or whatever it might be when people unknowingly don't set the privacy settings to such or whatever it might be, right? So I'm just curious if other states have actually had some experience and we can learn from that.
Excuse me, not to my knowledge. I think if we keep this portion of the definition, it could be worthwhile to engage in a consumer education campaign of some sort and educate consumers on what you do, like altering your privacy settings on your social media.
Right.
I think that might be a good alternative.
Right. Or all the other apps that people are unknowingly putting tons of data in many ways that may or may not have. Anyway, just, yeah.
And remember your question, at 11 o'clock, we have Maureen Mahoney from California Privacy Protection Agency, who's going to testify as well.
I will write it down. So
yeah, but that would be a good question for Maureen too.
Yep.
To see how California, if they've seen.
Okay. You're asking questions gives me a little relief.
Talk slower next time.
Okay. So there were some concerns around the definition of selling, sale, or sold, because it does include other things like renting, releasing, transferring, et cetera. There are ways we could change this definition if you want to, but I didn't do that here. Instead, I just want to provide context that this is lifted from California's privacy law, and it's designed to prevent bad actors from circumventing the right to opt out. So I think while it may be a misnomer, in one sense, I think it's important to keep in. Excuse me. Also, got rid of the definition shall be interpreted broadly. You could argue that a court might uphold that portion of a statute. I just don't think it's necessary. I think the way this definition is worded is clear. And I think we might run into problems if we keep we might get into a situation where a court might say Vermont is being overbroad if we keep something like that. Okay. Targeted advertising, this was not defined in the data minimization section of the bill originally. So lifted this from consumer reports. And to save my voice, I will let you all read it. And of course, happy to answer any questions too. Everybody okay?
Okay, that's another consumer reports definition. Check to see, I think Monique had checked prior one from consumer reports, and actually Colorado has that in their law. So we'll check to see if this is also made probably in Colorado as well.
Yeah, I will say this definition has changed a little bit based on the state that's adopted it. So for example, Connecticut's is a little different. They don't use the consumer reports definition. So we may receive feedback on this that we want it to be a little different. I would just warn that we don't want to get in a situation of creating loopholes where data collectors or data brokers can actually engage in certain types of targeted advertising that we might not like. So take that for what it is.
And this might already be covered. I'm double checking. So would this include, say, the companies that, like if you stay at a hotel and they know you're there and location and stuff, like Purple and stuff, and then they track you wherever you go, or if you use their hotel and that kind of stuff. Like, does that include physical versus just online or device targeted advertising? Or like stores that you pass by the window and then it shows you an ad because you're you're not actually like interacting with them, but you are because you're passing the window.
That's a great question. I don't think this does address that. I think this is just online activity. Okay. So this sort of preamble, there were questions around, there were Commerce Clause concerns and regulating data collectors, data brokers who might not be based in Vermont, but they touch Vermont consumers. This came up several years ago when the data broker law was being written and passed. How far can we reach? Because there's a question of interstate commerce. And I think the answer we reached then is the same answer we reach here, which is that if it does touch a Vermont consumer, then we have the right to regulate it. And this, I believe, is lifted. Yeah, this is lifted from Connecticut. This might not be the best place for this clause. I would defer to legislative counsel on where to put something like this. And I'll just read it. The provisions of this act apply to persons that conduct business in this state or persons that produce products or services that are targeted to residents of this state. Yeah, okay, I mentioned all of that. So is there any questions around this particular clause?
Actually, not about this class, but are you done the definitions section?
I am, yes.
Excellent. So just to jump back, do you have, just that sensitive personal information, do you have suggested language? Because I do think that's something that I would like to see a draft of, because I think it's an important aspect of this, given the times that we're living in.
Great. I lost my pen, but I will be sure to include that. Oh, thank you. Let me just make a note.
Thank you.
And you can keep the pen to have an extra.
Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, how are we all doing? Good? Okay, so moving on from the definition section to the data minimization section. There seemed to be, this section was pretty, I guess, small as originally proposed. So I think it may be useful to flesh this out a bit, because there were concerns about what does data minimization mean and how would we do this in Vermont? And so I think these changes help with that. I'll start with the fact that I deleted section A, application. It's just not necessary. This is kind of stating the obvious. And there were concerns about what it meant, so I thought it was better just to strike it. And then the data minimization section. Also want to provide some context here. This section, as it was originally drafted in this bill, was lifted from California's privacy law. But it was brought up by stakeholders that this stricken portion here can actually be a loophole for collectors and brokers. And so I deleted that. Any questions there? Okay. Moving down to section C, this again fleshes out what secondary uses mean, because I don't think it was quite clear what it meant before as the bill was originally drafted. And so now this is referencing California's privacy law, and I'll just read it. It now says, a business that controls the collection of a consumer's personal information shall, at or before the point of collection, inform consumers of the following. 1, the categories of PI to be collected and the purposes for which the categories of PI are collected or used, and whether the information is sold or shared. A data collector that obtains personal information from a consumer shall not use that information for additional purposes that are inconsistent with the purpose for which it was initially collected. Oops. Okay. Any questions about that?
Just that we're leaving in that last line without providing the consumer with notice consistent with the section.
That's new, but yes.
Yep, okay.
Okay. We also received feedback from stakeholders that there is no non-discrimination clause in this bill. That is very commonplace in other states' laws. And it ensures that if you are a data collector, data broker, you can't charge different rates, for example, based on whether you want to opt out from your data being collected. And so that is what this section reflects. I believe this is lifted from Connecticut. I'll let you all read it so I can save my voice. Okay, any questions there?
So in terms of data collection, so I know businesses, every once in a while we get emails saying that, hey, if you sign up for this and you give us your email address, we'll give you like 20% off this first order or something. So that would not apply since this goes specifically to data collection, not necessarily promotions, correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's correct.
Okay.
I think it's difficult for a data broker, for example, to engage in any discrimination, but, yeah, I'd like to think about that question a little bit, because I wonder if we would want to capture that.
Okay, no worries. I just wanted to, and one of the things I'm trying to also try and keep in mind as well, especially businesses do collect data on their consumers. That way they can have their targeted advertising. So I just want to make sure that, especially when we're talking about folks that are data collectors, that we're make sure that emphasize that the people that are necessarily going out there scraping the information and selling it on the open market, as opposed to the businesses that are collecting the information for their own marketing purposes. So that's just something I just wanted to be careful on, because I'm just trying to make sure that we're treading water correctly.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I will say there are situations, pretty common ones, where a data collector will collect information and then just sell it to a third party. And so we would want to make sure there's a catch-all there as well.
Perfect. And my apologies for having you use your voice.
You're fine.
Sarah, can you just go scroll back up? Sorry, I need to keep going backwards, but the part about the secondary use section.
Yeah.
So is there a reason you use the word business rather than data collector there?
Well, I was it seemed redundant to say a data collector that controls the collection of. I did think about that, but we could change it so we just say a data collector or a data collector at or before the point of collection informs the consumer of X. That could work too.
Yeah, and my reason is just because there are multiple entities, even if they're not for-profit businesses, that be collecting data, and especially for the secondary use piece of it, I just wouldn't want to inadvertently make a carve out that would not apply to nonprofits or whoever else is collecting that information and potentially would be sending it off for a secondary use.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so.
That's an easy change we can make. Okay.
The targeting advertising definition is almost exactly cut and paste from the Virginia law, so.
Okay. Good to know. I didn't realize they used the
Throwing it out there.
definition. Okay. So moving on to rights of consumers, you'll notice, yes.
Just back to the one we just looked at.
Yeah.
So there's times when you're signing up for something, you want something, and you have to click on affirmatively, or you get kicked off, and they don't sell it to you. And this actually is designed to take care of that issue.
Correct.
So you're opting out, but you still want the product.
Correct. Okay. Rights of consumers. You'll notice I struck the language. Consumers shall have the rights specified by rule by the Attorney General. As the only privacy attorney at the Attorney General's office, I admit I don't want to engage in a rulemaking that's very onerous and time consuming. It's also, it does put power within our office to create rules, which is commonplace. However, in my recent memory, we haven't done a rulemaking in a very, very long time. I think an alternative would be just to put language in the statute, and I think Legislative Counsel hinted at this as well, that lays out rights of consumers instead. And to that end, this, I believe, let me see. This one's lifted from Connecticut.
But it still doesn't prohibit the Attorney General's office from taking this, but also can still go into rulemaking. This is more of a bigger guide for you to do that. We don't have to give you specific authority.
That's right.
For rulemaking. You already have that authority, from what I understand.
Yes, and that's also in the enforcement section as well. Yeah. And so I will just let you all read this. I'll just scroll down a bit. There's also more we could do here if you want, but this is kind of the bare minimum. I think there is a benefit to making explicit the rights consumers have, because often that's not very clear. Okay, does anyone have any questions about that section?
Just around, I mean, this I think is really important because I'm just thinking around how easy it is to find information about other folks for nefarious reasons, for violent I mean, all these issues. And so I think it probably just goes back into a larger consumer protection education effort, so that even if we were to put something like this into the bill, how would one even start the process of knowing how to request, for example, to delete number 3 in here, delete personal information obtained about the consumer, for example, around any number of data points. But I think that's a really important part. It's one thing to make it so, but it's another for an actual regular person to be able to navigate that all and figure out, where do I even start? How do I even know who has my data? How do I start to, even
Right.
once I know, how do I start communicating and not just having multiple barriers where, I don't know. So it's more of a bigger question of, how do we make sure that this can be implemented by a regular homeowner?
Yeah, so I think the universal opt-out language that we have in this bill will absolutely help with that. And to my earlier point, engaging in some kind of consumer education. We have our consumer assistance program at UVM. I think this is ripe for, this area is ripe for some sort of education components. Okay.
And I think my point is so like opting out is like sort of on the front end before you dive into the new app or a new, relationship with a business or whatever. But I think I'm also thinking of the Vermonters who have had their information out there, and then a like circumstance happens, for example, they're getting stalked, they're in a abusive situation or whatever, and they need to suddenly retract a lot of information that's been out there. So I'm just trying to think how to make that possible so people can exert this right that we're trying to give them in this bill, but then know how to pull the information back in some way. I know it's a big thing, but I'm just trying to think forward about how to, not just be on the proactive end, but when unfortunately have to be reactive and pull your data back into a more private space.
Yeah, I will say the universal opt-out, it applies, it can apply at any time.
Okay.
Right? You can be a consumer and you can decide you no longer want your data tracked. But to your point, what do you do with the data that already has been tracked? I think that's an open question. And it goes to the push and pull of these sorts of laws. We're aiming to protect consumers the best we can, while also making this feasible for businesses. And the fact of the matter is, sadly, we can't account for every situation. And I think when your data is already out there, that might be a situation where we could run into some walls, so to speak. And I'm not sure if there's an answer on how best to address that.
I mean, it does sound like right to be forgotten laws, right, that are in place other places, not here.
Yeah.
It's not like it doesn't exist.
Right. I mean, you have the right to be forgotten, but
Yeah.
how feasible is that? I mean,
Right, yeah.
think of Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation, if any of you watched that show. And he tried to get rid of everything, but it's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay.
Sarah, is it something that you thought of when Emma brought up that when we're talking about, businesses that are using information for nefarious, is there anything in any of the laws that talk about, like in the banking world, know your customer? That any of the other jurisdictions have looked at or put in place or talked about? I'm just, we've done similar things years ago in consumer protection, talking about third party that, you need to know your customer. If you know that they're know, they've been charged or they've been acting in a nefarious way, that they're kind of part of that liability chain as well, if they don't do any positive things to stop that or stop doing business with that customer.
So I'm sorry, what's your question?
So is there anything in any of the consumer protection realm that we're dealing with now, data privacy, data protection, that talks about know your customer? Where you're, you know, as a data broker, you have somebody purchasing data from you, and you find out that what they're doing is not kosher, and you know, could bring a liability, and you could be in that liability chain, and you need
Yes. I'd say that would fall squarely under the Consumer Protection Act, section 2453, where if you engage in any unfair or deceptive practices, then you may be subject to liability.
Well, I mean, that's, but that is for, you know, business that's doing the deception. But there's also businesses that supply information to a business that does that. And so I want to make sure that that business, if they continue, once they've found out that this business is not a business that they should be dealing with, and they continue to provide that information, that they're, I think they would be also liable under the consumer protection law.
Yes.
Should-
Yep, agreed. Okay. All right. Now, I changed this a bit, so you have section E, rights of consumers, and then subsection 1 under E1, I guess. Made more sense, I think, to draft it this way. And there's the do not track sections, which I didn't change, with the exception of the last portion of that sentence that meets the technical specifications established by the Attorney General. This was lifted from Colorado's law, where they did engage in a rulemaking and they did set technical specifications for do not track. Sadly, we just don't have the resources in Vermont to do that. And I think because we flesh out these various terms in the definition section, as well as the opt-out section, that covers this section. So the Attorney General needing to set technical specifications, I don't think is necessary. Okay, and then E2, this beefs up the opt-out section, since there were some questions about what it means to have a universal opt-out. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but one thing I want to point out is that a consumer can designate what's known as an authorized agent to opt them out on their behalf. So a consumer, the onus is not on the consumer necessarily to opt out of every little listserv, app, etc. Instead, they can designate an authorized agent to do so. And there are plenty of these across the country that do this for their business. So it's quite feasible.
When people opt out, do they have the ability to opt back in again if they want to?
They do. Almost always.
Okay, so I guess I worry a little bit about designating another person. If there's an issue that happens between one person person and their designated agent, that what happens if that designated agent is not changed and starts opting them back into everything?
Yeah, it's fraught with fraud.
Well, I'm just wondering about, could that intentionally harm the person who actually designated somebody else as their agent?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would need to run that question down and see whether that's been something other states have run into, or if it's simply a risk you take if you do use an authorized agent. I'm not sure, so.
What, I guess, are there other parts of any statute that gets at the person acting as an agent that does, nefarious things to the person that they authorized, that authorized them to be their agent? I
So,
would assume there would be, but
yeah,
if there is, and if it's somewhere else, we might want to make sure that we're referencing that. Yeah.
I think as I go through this, the enforcement section will help. I think I'm getting to it soon. Oh, but before that, we have the exemptions. Excuse me. So this was probably the largest point of feedback our office received about H-121. What every other state is doing with respect to privacy is having certain carve-outs based on the type of data used. So, for example, any kind of health-related data would be covered under HIPAA. Financial data is covered under the Gramm-Leachy Act. Credit reporting data covered under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so I think it makes perfect sense for Vermont to follow suit in this space. One caveat I would highlight is that I think it's very important to have information-based exemptions as opposed to entity-based exemptions. We've heard from several states who have entity-based exemptions that have run into problems where they can't actually use their enforcement authority over certain types of organizations, namely nonprofits, because they're actually exempt from this law. So I would really caution against having carve-outs for specific types of businesses and just focus on the type of data that's collected.
Okay. The carve-outs, can you click onto your comment?
Oh, yeah.
Just so we, okay, Connecticut law.
Mhm.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yes, so this is heavily influenced by Connecticut. Connecticut took cues from Colorado, Virginia, so they're all kind of the same. Also importantly, so this is kind of a laundry list of, that says nothing in this section shall be construed to restrict a data collector or data broker's ability to. And one of the ones I wanted to point out is, there are a lot of these. Bear with me. Well, overall, it's just where they use data to prevent fraud or cooperate with law enforcement. I think that's an important carve out, and that is reflected here. So this is about 15 different carve outs that we have. I'm sorry if you're seeing these pop-ups on my screen. That kind of run the gamut. But then we get into additional types of data that are already subject to privacy regulations. that are already existing in certain laws, namely HIPAA. But as I mentioned before, we also have things like Healthcare Quality Improvement Act. We have, this is mostly HIPAA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, excuse me, I misspoke on that earlier. Drivers Privacy Protection Act. So that's, providing driver information.
You got 2 tens there.
You're right, I do. Again, I don't do this for a living, right? So,
David's gonna run this.
yes,
Put
yep.
this in legislative form.
So again, this is lifted almost verbatim from Connecticut, which reflects several other states that have passed these kinds of exemptions. I'm not an expert on all of these different types of laws. So if you want feedback on whether these exemptions are sufficient, it might be worthwhile to bring in folks from those various industries to discuss whether these carve-outs are acceptable. But I would gather they are, because this is exactly what other states are doing. And because this is so long, I apologize. I'm not going to read it to you. But I would encourage you to take a closer look at that.
I'm sure we'll hear if we missed any.
Yes. Okay, lastly, enforcement. So, Mr. Chair, I think this might address some of your concerns around nefarious actors. This is pretty much boilerplate language that already exists in Chapter 62 as well as Chapter 63. And that reference to Chapter 63 makes clear that we can bring a CPA, a Consumer Protection Act claim against anybody that might violate this chapter. Any questions? While you're all reading, I'm going to just grab a couple more cough drops just in case. Are you ready to move on?
So I just want to be sure that an agent acting on behalf of someone, if they're acting in a manner outside of the authority that that person gave them to act on their behalf, or if they're doing things in reverse of what they wanted, that under the Consumer Protection Act, the Attorney General or the state's attorney can go after them as well? Or can they also take them into civil court?
There is no private right of action in this section, so no.
But it's, so it's only up to the state's attorney.
Yes. And the AG, yep. Okay. Now, notice of data broker security breach, excuse me. I don't know about you all, but I always interchange data and data. So I apologize if that's confusing. I didn't make any changes to this section. David Hall mentioned he hadn't necessarily looked, but had an inkling that this was almost verbatim what's already in the Notice Security Breach Act. And so it may be worthwhile to reconcile this with that section of the act, just to make it cleaner. Let's see here. There were a few concerns that came up around regulating data brokers in this space generally, with respect to opt-out provisions, as well as having them report security breaches. So I just wanted to say a few words about that. Vermont is on the cutting edge when it comes to regulating data brokers. We have seen at the state level, New Jersey and Oregon are now looking to follow Vermont's lead and have a data broker registration requirement. We're also seeing action at the federal level. There is a bill that would regulate data brokers in the reproductive space. So it is top of mind at the federal level as well that data brokers are an entity to watch. And I just saw a news story today that the FTC is also starting a rulemaking that's looking into data brokers. So I would say I'm less concerned about this section for a few reasons. One, we are now not alone. We are not an outlier in this space. And two, I have not heard, with the exception of wanting to have a carve out for reporting to law enforcement and investigating fraud, I have not heard from any data brokers who oppose either the security breach reporting requirements or the opt-out provisions, which leads me to believe that if data brokers are not already engaging in this kind of behavior, they have the ability to do so. So I would not be scared about implementing this section. I would say with respect to the security breaches specifically, when data brokers register with the Secretary of State, they're required to report on their security breaches when they register. So they're already doing some form of it. This is just a matter of changing the timing. So they would need to report security breaches in real time as opposed to retroactively. Does that make sense? And I already highlighted the commerce concerns that I talked about at the top, but if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because, oh wait, I have one more thing. Okay, so I'm going to move on from the data broker piece unless there are questions. Okay. Now I'm going to go all the way to the end to show that I got rid of this, which I already talked about. We don't want to do a study. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. I will say a few more words about the BIPA portion of the bill. So the one point of the only substantive feedback we've received, our office has received on this, is with respect to the private right of action. Of course, businesses don't want consumers to have the ability to individually sue them and open them up to lots of liability. However, this law is based on Illinois' BIPA bill, which was passed over a decade ago. It has been in effect. It has been working. It also has a private right of action. Courts, over, I would say in the past 3 to 5 years, have been ruling in favor of consumers in this space. The kind of bellwether case, I think, is the White Castle case that came out of the Seventh Circuit. And that ruled in favor of a consumer who sued when her fingerprint was being scanned as an employee of White Castle. And they then sold that data to a third party without her consent, and she sued. The court ruled in favor of the consumer. So we are much less concerned about the private right of action because the law's been on the books for so long. Courts are ruling in favor of consumers in that space. And this is the hill our office is willing to die on with respect to the BIPA. We want the private right of action in. And I'll just say, this law makes really clear that if you are a nefarious actor, for example, or even if you just are, this is your business model where you are scanning any kind of biometric data and then selling it without someone's consent, that's against the law. It's as simple as that. Let's see. One last thing I wanted to address, there were some First Amendment concerns raised. The infamous IMS v. Sorrell case always comes up. Our office did a First Amendment analysis on this bill. And we found that unlike the IMS Sorrell case, which had very obvious speaker and content-based discrimination, that is not here because it applies to pretty much everyone who collects any kind of data. So this is not singling out certain actors depending on what they're doing. And I think that's pretty much it, unless there are questions. Thank you all for your patience and dealing with my coughing.
You did well to get through.
Thank you.
We appreciate, certainly appreciate the time that you and DUG's office have taken in responding to, listening to various groups and responding to them. We will hear from Maureen at 11. What I would say is that, and this is for anyone in the room and outside the room, that next week we'll be taking more testimony on this new draft. Once David has it drafted, we'll get it out to everyone. But we'll be, I'm asking people to respond to what we just went through and continue to take more testimony on that, and then see if we're getting to a better place where we could put this together and move it by the end of the session. So I think we're a lot closer than we were a couple of weeks ago. So if there's no other questions.
And one sort of caveat I just wanted to give is that these changes are suggested changes. So we, of course, are open to scaling it back if that's what the committee wants to do, or expanding it for that matter. I think it's very fluid, and we want to make it as good of a bill as we can with the limited time we have. We don't want any of these changes to be a hindrance to actually moving the bill.
I think, one thing for me is I want to make sure that whatever we craft, we're looking at different state laws outside of Vermont, that we're crafting something that's not a Frankenstein, that we need to make sure that the businesses that are out there can comply easily with California or Vermont or Connecticut. So I want to make sure that we're in that realm. So it's not, we're not, I don't want to be a one-off. I think
this brings us a lot closer to not being a one-off. I will say, I think the way the bill is currently drafted is a Frankenstein, mainly with respect to all the different definitions of personal information that we have. So if the committee's open to a broader but simpler definition that encapsulates everything, that could be a good option.
okay.
A couple questions. So I'm thinking about how fast technology is progressing, and I just wanted to, I don't know how we can do this, or if we can, will you think this will stand the test of a short-term time, or like how often? I guess my concern is standing the test of time. Just thinking like some of the things that are coming up that misusing people's faces, placing them in photos, using voice, making them say things that they didn't say, like all, like how, and that's all data, right? So how,
Yeah, so I think this goes to laws being living documents. Meaning that this law will be on the books and it may be able to stand the test of time. But amendments, are not always a bad thing. And with technology changing so rapidly, I think, the data broker piece and chapter 62 was passed only a few years ago and now we're doing this bill, right? And so I think, while this can absolutely do its job in the long term, there will likely need to be some tweaking made as the years go on.
that, and I understand that there's drafting now going on at the federal level on privacy.
Yes, so there's the American Data Privacy Protection Act. Last summer, that was passed out of committee, but my understanding is that it's not going to be picked up again anytime soon. And that's not because there's a divided Congress. This is actually a bipartisan issue, privacy. The problem is that California is a major stakeholder and its congressional delegation is not on board with the federal privacy law as it's currently drafted, because it would effectively preempt states in several spaces. My understanding is that California has several more strict provisions in its law that would be preempted, and that's causing a real problem with California. So yeah, as much as I would love a federal standard, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So unfortunately, you are dealing with kind of a more patchwork across different states, but the trend that I have seen is that states are all taking cues from each other and passing very similar legislation.
Thank you.
Other questions, Sarah? Okay,
Thank you.
we can go off